Nouriel Robinini. You may have not heard of this CEO, but what he just said in his Bloomberg interview may be the single most important 8 minutes in finance history if what he predicts comes true in the next year. Roubini's theory is one based on earlier comments made by Ray Dalio and Larry Summers, two of America's most prominent billionaires who have been consistently speaking out about the incoming inflationary crisis that will doom this country. Take a listen to his first comment from the interview, a call on America's future.
We also have debt on top of it. You're looking at your stagflationary debt crisis. Is it here?
It's on its way here. I agree with Ray Dalio. I agree with Larry Summers and many others who worry that there's going to be overheating because we have a loose monetary and fiscal policy, and that could lead to inflation. But I have a second worry and a third worry. The second worry is that in addition to aggregate demand becoming excessive, we're going to suffer supply bottlenecks. And those supply bottlenecks are not the short-term ones driven by, say, unemployment benefits. I've identified 9 forces that are much more secular, that like in the 70s represent negative global supply shocks that reduce potential growth, increase the cost of production, and with loose monetary and fiscal policy can lead not only to inflation, but also to stagflation, a combination of inflation and recession like we had in the 1970s when you had 2 oil shocks.
Nouriel talks fast, but if you caught what he said there at the end, he not only agrees with Dalio and Summers, but on top of this, he adds that the United States will soon face stagflation, similar to what happened in the 1970s. Stagflation is defined as a situation in which the inflation rate is high, economic growth slows, and unemployment remains steadily high. Believe it or not, stagflation was thought to be impossible before the 1970s, according to many economists who had theorized that with economic growth comes inflation, which in turn leads to more jobs and less unemployment. This concept was known as the Phillips curve, but ultimately it proved to be another case where the academics were wrong and real life was just way more complex and harder to predict than what was theorized. High unemployment and high inflation was possible, and to measure this, my favorite index ever was introduced by Arthur Aucon, called the Misery Index, a simple measurement that combined the unemployment rate with the inflation rate. According to the Misery Index, the worst month in the history of this country since 1900 was June of 1980, when the unemployment rate was around 8% and the inflation rate read a crazy 14%. During this time, the US was in the middle of a severe economic recession that affected much of the world between January of 1980 to early 1983. A key event leading to the recession was the 1979 energy crisis, mostly caused by the Iranian Revolution, which created massive disruptions to the global oil supply. Today, the Misery Index reads 11.29, which is relatively high for recent years, especially those after the Great Recession, but it's still not at crisis levels. However, if another economic crisis were to happen soon, the Fed would be ill-equipped to deal with it, since its typical economy-saving measures have already been used up. The interest rate is near zero, and the amounts of stimulus it has provided have pushed the economy forward, but if it proves to be not enough, the Fed bazooka will have to become exponentially more powerful to push back a second recession. Nouriel Robinini is under the impression that this time around the situation is much more dangerous than the 1970s, and the consequences of stagflation could be extreme. Take a listen to his second comment, but before I show you, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you're enjoying the content. Now back to the video.
We have seen over time historic change. How does America do secular stagnation when we have a tech juggernaut like we're observing right now with Apple, Amazon, Google, and that? How do we bring their excellence over to the American experience?
Well, even Larry Summers, who was worried about secular stagnation, now worries about inflation. The trouble is that we're facing a whole problems from a political point of view in terms of a gridlock, not just in the US, but also in other parts of the world, because there are lots of people who are left behind. And whether they're voting for Trump or they're voting for Democrats or voting in Europe for populist party of the right and the left, they're against globalization, they're against technology, they're against hyper-digitalization. But we also live in a world in which, as I pointed out, I worry that in spite of technology, maybe as it has been in the last 20 years, a force for deflation, there are other forces that are going to be stagflationary. They're going to be reducing potential growth and increased cost of production. because of inequality, we have deglobalization, we have protectionism, and everybody wants to defend their own firms and workers. We're going to now see balkanizations of global supply chains and the reshoring of manufacturing from low-cost China to US and Europe.
So according to Nouriel, there are many factors that will act upon the economy, preventing technology from acting like the typical deflationary force it used to be. If you listen to other hedge fund managers like Cathie Wood, they always claim that inflation is nothing to worry about since new technologies will always have a greater deflationary force on the economy, preventing inflation from spiraling out of control. Nouriel counters with 8 different forces that puts this theory into jeopardy. One of those includes something called the balkanization of supply chains. Over the past decade, we have seen a couple of black swan events, most notably the recent pandemic, that have put a strain on the typical global supply chain model. Both of these things will act as inflationary forces and add more pressure to the already failing economy. Of course, just like Ray Dalio and Larry Summers, the theory sounds great on paper, but ultimately it has been very, very wrong in the past year. On the other side of the coin, since January of 2020, the S&P 500 gained 19%. That's quite the return, and we're not even close to ending the year. How this all plays out will be very interesting. Trying to time this market or going short is clearly a recipe for disaster, as it becomes almost fact that stocks do indeed only go up. Looking over this chart of the Nasdaq, you can clearly see just how amazing stocks have performed over the past year, growing almost exponentially. Being a bear in this market is hard, and one by one they're being run over by the bulls, who seemingly have the entire world and the Fed behind them, pushing prices up and up with almost no number being out of reach. Thank you guys for watching, and as always, please make sure you hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed. Also, if you're thinking about diversifying some of your net worth into crypto, please consider using my affiliate link for BlockFi below. I've been using the service for almost 3 months now, and I've earned some pretty serious interest on top of some crypto gains.